History's most one-sided wars. There's that quote about all being fair in love and war, but I don't think that someone swinging their sword at an Ordnance BL 5-inch howitzer artillery cannon would find it very fair. Well, that's pretty much what happened during the Battle of Omdurman. Now, if you're familiar with African history around the turn of the 20th century, you know that it was nothing short of a shit show. European powers were grabbing anything and everything they could get their hands on to see what natural resources could be tapped into. As for the British, one of their more tactical moves was seizing control of the Egyptian territory from the Ottoman Empire in the late 1880s. Why Egypt? Well, because Egypt has the Suez Canal, basically a super sweet shortcut connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and thus the Indian Ocean. Guess who owned India at the time? Also the British. So instead of slogging the freshly plundered raw materials all the way around the scenic circumference of Africa, merchants could just speedrun that shit through the Suez, potentially saving months of sailing. Now, with the seizure of Egypt came a bit of a bonus, some territory to the south, known as Sudan, but it came with some baggage of its own. If Egypt were to be the crisp, clean shirt in the deal, Sudan was going to be the pants. And these pants were about to be shat. So while the British now controlled Sudan on paper, it wasn't really the case in reality, at least not yet. Throwing even more chaos into the mix were the not-so-modest Mahdists, an independent Islamic group that rose up and rebelled against their Ottoman Egyptian oppressors, establishing their own state in the Sudanese territory back when the Ottomans controlled the region just a decade earlier. They didn't give a flying flip that the British were now the technical rulers of the land. Oppressors were oppressors. As a matter of fact, they were feeling a bit big in the britches after just toppling the Ottoman control, so they were eager to start round two. The British, though, initially wanted to abandon Sudan, declaring it too much of a political and financial burden to deal with, what with all the squabbling and whatnot. They would instead leave the Mahdists to have their own land and not intervene. However, continued Mahdist aggression led to the death of one Charles Gordon, a renowned British general who was tasked with evacuating civilians from the Sudanese spit-sounding capital city of Khartoum. Mahdist soldiers slaughtered around 10,000 innocent civilians in the wake of Charles's assassination. This single act switched British opinion from indifference to vowing vengeance. Thus, in 1896, the British began the Anglo-Egyptian conquest of Sudan. This war lasted about 3 years, with British forces steamrolling the Mahdists in virtually every encounter. Well, if it's so one-sided, why did it take 3 years? Good question. This was actually by design. You see, the British were slowly advancing into Sudan, building a supply railroad behind them the whole way so as to not have supplies run dry and be caught with their pants down, an issue that had previously plagued the British in the past. The conquest culminated in the Battle of Omdurman on September 2nd, 1898. Oof, just lasting a single day, huh? Talk about foreboding. Yeah, so this battle wasn't so much of a battle as it was a full-blown massacre. Here's where the one-sidedness kicks in. About 26,000 British and Egyptian troops faced off against over 50,000 Sudanese warriors. Seems like a slam dunk for Sudan, but sheer size is no match for optimal equipment. Remember that supply railway I just mentioned? Well, it supplied the British front lines with 17,000 rolling block rifles, 8,000 bolt-action rifles, 44 artillery cannons, and 40 state-of-the-art water-cooled Maxim automatic machine guns. Oh yeah, there was also a handful of naval gunboats ready to tear shit up from the banks of the Nile. The Mahdists, well, you know, they tried. They had several thousand firearms seized from previous battles, as well as a few dozen artillery, but yeah, they were either poorly maintained or those operating them were poorly trained. The unlucky fellas not equipped with firearms instead brandished the old reliable sword and shield, and it went just about as well as you'd think. The Mahdists were completely and utterly destroyed. According to 23-year-old British Lieutenant Winston Churchill, yes, that Winston Churchill, approximately 11,000 Mahdist soldiers lay dead, 16,000 wounded, and over 4,000 captured. The rest either surrendered or just fled. As for the British, less than 50 soldiers were killed in battle, a testament to the sheer imbalance of weapons technology and tactical warfare. After the battle, the Mahdist state was effectively dismantled, cementing British dominance in Sudan. Sometimes, wars can be won without inflicting any real damage. You just have to be well-versed in the art of intimidation. Even if you're a tiny pushover, you can still get your way if you make yourself seem scary enough. Booga, booga, booga! The Kettle War is a prime example of this tactic. At the end of the 80 Years' War back in 1648, the Dutch gained independence from the Spanish. In addition to establishing their own little republic within the Netherlands, the Dutch had full access to a gaping mouth, the mouth of the Scheldt River. This was a critical trade route for many cities just south of the newly formed republic, cities that were still under smelly Spanish control. So the Dutch took advantage of the situation. Oh yeah, time to close the river. The Dutch cut off all trade access through the Scheldt, completely crippling the economies of the downstream cities. Instead, trade was diverted through the Dutch ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, allowing them to flourish into dominant trade hubs. The funny thing though, nothing would be done about it for 136 years. But in the late 1700s, there was a new sheriff in town for the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II, and he did not like the Dutch doing what they were doing. As a rather ambitious reformer, he was aiming to make his empire the main political and economic power in Europe, but the whole closure of the Scheldt thing was a big old turd in the punch bowl of his plans, so he needed to act, and act he did. Having just gotten their strength kicked in by the British during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1784, Joseph II decided to take advantage of a now weakened Dutch republic. The demand was simple: open up the river or go to war. Now, when your territory is like this and another territory threatening you looks like this, it might be best to just let them have this one. In reality, however, the Holy Roman Empire's army was fairly scattered across the mainland, being particularly small and ill-equipped near the Netherlands, so the immediate threat was minimal at best. As a show of force though, and to keep up the illusion of strength, Joseph sent out a small squadron of 3 naval warships, led by the heavily armed, no-nonsense having flagship Le Louis. The ships were sent to the mouth of the Scheldt to sit there and look intimidating. The Dutch, however, called the empire out on their bluff. On October 9th, 1784, they intercepted the 3 opposing warships with one of their own, the Dolphin, and it was looking to blow some holes into other ships. In an act of intimidation of their own, the Dolphin fired a single warning shot towards Le Louis. A soup in the morning, a soup at night, a soup every day makes me feel right. Oh man, now I'm super depressed. The warning shot from the Dolphin whizzed through the galley of Le Louis, causing the casualty of a single soup kettle. Hilariously, the crew of Le Louis surrendered immediately, chalking up a victory for the Dutch Republic with a single cannon shot. Joseph II, not to be embarrassed, declared full-on war, but no violence ever came of it. Instead, both agreed to negotiate. The result? The Scheldt remained closed, but the Dutch would compensate the Holy Roman Empire a hefty sum for the inconvenience. Around 2 to 10 million Dutch guilder, or roughly $120 to $600 million in today's money. I'd say that compensates for the soup. My soup. War and drugs is a pretty solid combination, but when said substances are used in warfare, it becomes a whole other matter entirely. Let's touch back on the early 1800s. Despite being halfway around the world, the British Empire still commanded trade in the Indian Ocean, even stretching into the Pacific, with one of their main suppliers being Imperial China. The Qing dynasty was doling out all kinds of goods to the Brits, including earthy herbs, soft silks, precious porcelain, and the iconic British life fuel, tea. While this trade was good for the British consumer, the rather one-sided trade imbalance left British merchants a tad miffed. The British Empire was absolutely hemorrhaging silver to pay for all of the goods with no reciprocity. The Chinese simply had little to no interest in British goods like wool or cotton. And that was a problem as British silver reserves were drying up, putting a damper on the liquidity of trade in the region. So what do you do if there's no demand? You force it. The British began secretly exporting Indian-grown opium into Chinese ports. Smugglers paid for the opium with silver, which then paid for more Chinese goods, completing a more sustainable trade loop. British merchants were happy, Chinese smugglers were happy, the majority of the Chinese population were suffering crippling addiction. You know how it goes. So yeah, it's no surprise that opium demand soon turned exponential. From 1797 to 1833, opium imports soared from 680,000 pounds a year to over 5.1 million pounds a year. I mean, it was a silver gold mine. Even American merchants got in on the action, selling Turkish opium to China. But this started to tip the scales too far in the other direction, now with the Chinese silver reserves reaching unsustainable levels, not to mention the effects on the general population. Before, the average British consumer was just sipping their Chinese tea from ornate porcelain cups while relaxing in their comfy silk robes. Now, the average Chinese consumer was struggling to detach themselves from their pipe. Although the Chinese emperor had outright banned opium usage, it didn't stop the average fella from getting their fix. Millions upon millions were addicted, leading to a drastic decline in productive laborers, merchants, farmers, and teachers. Well, in 1839, the Chinese emperor put his silky slippered foot down. Severe punishments were put in place for anyone dabbling in deals of opium. All imports of the stuff were seized and destroyed. Famously, the kickstart of the Opium War was the seizure and destruction of over 2.9 million pounds of opium in one go. The British were not pleased with getting shafted out of payment for the product, so they demanded reparations. At cannon point. Just a year later in 1840, a British naval fleet positioned itself off of China's eastern coast and began bringing the heat, bullying various islands into submission as to establish a base of operations. Let's take a look at the roster for both sides. The British in this campaign commanded over 19,000 soldiers and 37 ships. Standing in China's corner, though, was an estimated 100,000 mobilized infantry. China had the numbers, but Britain had the technology. Chinese fortresses? Demolished. Resistance groups? Destroyed. Innocent civilian generational homesteads? Deleted. Campaigning up the Pearl River, the British blasted their way to the Chinese commercial heart of Canton, still hell-bent on getting their compensation. Sir, the British are here. Both parties sat down at a pretty cool looking table and agreed to peace terms. But the overarching powers in charge, mainly the Qing Emperor and the British Foreign Secretary, refused said terms, prompting the supersaturated British to withdraw from the Pearl and shoot up the Yangtze River to clog any and all economic arteries. This forced China to renegotiate the peace conditions, resulting in the drafting of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. As a result, opium usage remained illegal, but new trade ports would be open to British imports, which, hilariously enough, was still royal shit tons of opium. The island of Hong Kong was ceded to the British as a colony, and China was forced to pay nearly 26 million silver dollars in reparations to the British. This comes out to roughly $830 million in purchasing power, or roughly $1.3 billion in silver value alone. Now, there was a second opium war a few decades later, but just like a bunch of farmers winning 2 donkey auctions, the Chinese got their asses handed to them a second time. This one's a classic. Now, I briefly ran through this one in my History Facts You Wouldn't Believe Are True video, but let's revisit it with a deeper understanding and some better artwork. The Anglo-Zanzibar War holds the record as the shortest war in known human history, lasting just 38 minutes. I mean, your commute home is probably longer than that. You're listening to D101 The Shaft. All other radio stations can suck a dick. The reasoning behind the war was very simple. By the end of the 1800s, Zanzibar was a major trade hub off the eastern coast of Africa. Whoever controlled it had massive influence in the region's exchange of goods, including spices, ivory, and the frequent slave or two, including all profits that go with it. With European powers scrambling for Africa, Britain needed to cement its ability to control trade, hence the discussion about it taking Egypt in the first chapter. But Zanzibar was also unethically up for grabs. A treaty was signed in 1890, and the nation of Zanzibar, while remaining independent, became a British protectorate, meaning that the British technically held power over Zanzibar, but it could self-govern with guaranteed British protection should things go awry. On August 25, 1896, the British Empire's favorite sultan, along with his esteemed beard, received a sudden and premature ticket to paradise. Some believe he may or may not have been poisoned, but no proof has ever surfaced to support that claim. What's suspicious, though, is that the Sultan's less impressive facial hair-having cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, decided to claim the throne for himself while the previous Sultan's body was still warm. Oh, and fun fact, this same guy lost out on the throne just 3 years prior. Highly suspicious, one might say, fingering their mustache. Unfortunately for Khalid, only a British-approved Sultan could sit on the throne. Unfortunately for the British, he didn't give a fuck. In case you didn't know, the name Khalid in Arabic means immortal or everlasting, a name that was about to be put to the test using multiple British gunboats just strapped to the tits with cannons and machine guns. On August 26th, the very next day after the Sultan had just died, Khalid was given an ultimatum: surrender by 9 a.m. the next morning or be converted into a fine red mist. Khalid refused, not believing that the British had the balls to actually do anything about it. As a precaution, he had assembled a small army of his own, including a few outdated cannons and guns, but the comparison of firepower was laughable. Multiple warnings were given to the usurper the next morning, up until an hour before the deadline. However, the warnings fell on deaf ears. The clock struck the hour, 9 a.m. The air was still with a deafening silence so quiet, you could hear a subscribe button click. The order was given. The gunboats unleashed their volleys on the Sultan's palace for 38 minutes. Suffice to say, it was completely destroyed. After the guns fell silent, over 500 men and women, mostly innocent civilians, lay dead. The British suffered only one injury, a simple splinter from flying debris. As for Khalid, he snuck off into hiding but was eventually captured and exiled. That afternoon, the British placed a new approved sultan in place, and within a few weeks a new palace was built. A happy ending for most. This episode of Chat History is called Emu War. Listen, I know the subject has been beaten to death worse than a wife at an alcoholics convention, but now it's my turn. Back in 1932, the inverted hellhole that is Australia had one heck of a problem. After the Great War, returning veterans needed something to help them cope with the fact that they just lived through the most traumatic event of their lives. So far. In order to supply such a remedy, the Australian government encouraged returning veterans to settle on remote farmland out west. This relaxing, freeing, open-air experience hypothetically would do the mind and body good for the recovering war heroes. But with a lack of farming experience and putting said low-level farmers in less than ideal agricultural conditions, it became way more of a burden than a life of leisure. Oh yeah, and that Great Depression thing was going on. What, you thought that was just a United States thing? No. It was a worldwide catastrophe. To throw even more salt in the wound, wheat prices were taking a pounding. So not only was it a pain to grow, but yielding any wheat, ironically enough, wasn't netting much bread. But then comes the main villain of the story. With environmental, mental, and financial odds stacked against them, the Aussies faced one more foe. The dreaded emu. Bleh. Actually, it was more like 20,000 emus. A massive mob of the flightless birds had migrated from more central regions of the outback towards the west in search of cooler temperatures and more fruitful areas for public mastication. Unfortunately for the aspiring farmers, such a source of sustenance was their main cash crop, the wheat. The emus swarmed the farmlands, consuming everything in their wake, so the farmers phoned the government. Oi, government! These right cunts are eating all me crops! The news spread quickly, making it all the way up to the Minister of Defense, who approved a military intervention to deal with the pest problem. The solution? A few lead pills administered through an ergonomic dispenser. They were gonna shoot them. Deployed onto the field were 2 Lewis light machine guns with approximately 10,000 rounds and a military vehicle for mobility. The basic idea was to scare off the flocks and send them back where they came from, or at least somewhere that wasn't farmland. But things of course didn't go according to plan. To make up for the fact that they're flightless, emus are extreme sprinters, capable of topping out at around 30 miles an hour. Also keep in mind that emus can stand as tall as 6.5 feet and weigh over 130 pounds, so these feathered balls of rage were no pushovers. Righto, let's open her up. The emus were slippery little devils, able to weave in and out of the gunfire pretty effectively. They ran around all over the place, tearing up crops in the process. But the real kick in the dick here is that they refused to relocate away from their newfound food source. After a few weeks, only a few hundred emus were slain, barely a dent in the total population. So the government tried again, improving ambush tactics and rallying locals to help out. They were way more successful, bringing the kill count to about 1,000. Still only about 5% of the estimated population. The Australian government threw in the towel, with the public deeming the operation a waste of government resources amidst a global economic crisis. Despite staring down the barrel of a machine gun, the emus were declared the victors. For now. In addition to erecting more effective fencing, the government turned to the everyday citizen for help, providing free or subsidized ammo for some good old-fashioned giant bird hunting. Within just 6 months, over 50,000 bounties had been claimed and paid out, and over the next few decades, this number grew to nearly 300,000. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
Where's the lamb sauce?
Those idiots always forget the lamb sauce. Well, that sucks. Looks like you are in for another round of survival, but hey, at least the witch wasn't part of this one, right? Right, so let's see what you're made of. I'm gonna go narrate from a safe distance. Good luck. Alright, so first you're gonna need to assess any immediate damage and take stock of what you have. Or you could panic and make hasty decisions instead. See what happens when you panic? Now, take a deep irradiated breath and just think for a second here. Judging by the fact that the nuclear plant is like right there, it's safe to say that you're well within the danger zone. Hope that cheaper house price was worth it. Your immediate and best move is to go back into your house and shelter in place since you know that there's at least some food and water there. Make sure all of your windows and doors are sealed shut to keep out any unwanted radiation and/or people. Desperate times create desperate people. Also, try to stay in the center of your house or bunker down in the basement. You might also want to take the time to contact those you care about. Oh wait, in this hypothetical scenario, you're a complete loner who doesn't have much in the ways of loved ones. Except your buddy Ron, but you never invite him over. Oh well, the less people you have in your life, the less you have to be concerned about in an emergency situation. Who needs loved ones? Not you. Hypothetically, of course. Also, your phone has no signal thanks to extreme network congestion and plot convenient factors. They never work when you need them to. Speaking of people, be glad you're not out in that traffic jam. They're about to learn a thing or two about nuclear fallout. See, when a nuclear source detonates, that explosion will vaporize and launch a bunch of stinky radioactive material out over yonder. Fallout can come in many flavors, ranging from small sand-like particles to large heavy debris and even a mediocre franchise. Either way, this stuff is deadly. Any form of contact will likely result in radiation burns. What's radiation? It's just traveling energy. Heat from the sun? Radiation. Wi-Fi? Radiation. Your buddy Raymond from Japan? Radiation. These examples, though, are considered low-energy radiation, also known as non-ionizing radiation, meaning that they aren't strong enough to cause any physical harm. Except Ray. Nuclear radiation, however, can. And it will. You can think of high-energy or ionizing radiation as a bunch of itty-bitty fists just penetrating your soft, vulnerable body and beating the ever-loving crap out of your internal molecules, particularly your DNA. Now here's a lesson for you. Your DNA is your genetic information, passed on to you through many generations. Your mom, your dad, your grandparents too. Some from Emo Mary and the balls of Grandpa Lou. Looking like a ladder with a big old twist, it's pretty complicated, but you'll get the gist. All these little rungs determine all your bits. Brown eyes, quick wits, thick thighs or nice tits. Are you breathing without heaving, maybe blinking without thinking? Then thank your DNA for all the heavy lifting. Adenine for A, cytosine for C. Guanine is your G and thymine is your T. With the C to the G and the T to the A is what keeps you alive at the end of the day. Now, if this rhyme made your dopamine spike, then hit that subscribe or at least give a like. Thank you. Anyway, if you leave yourself unprotected, then all of that high energy radiation comes in and just gives your DNA a what for, severing them critical bonds and altering your genetic code, which will more or less lead to developmental issues and cancer down the road. One positive about nuclear fallout is that its radioactivity decays very fast. According to the US Department of Health and Human Services, within the first 7 hours, the fallout has already lost 90% of its dose rate of radiation. If you wait a full 48 hours, that increases to 99%. Sure, I wouldn't advise making dust angels in it, but it's better than what happened to those traffic jam people. Poor souls. The point is, patience and planning will get you through this. Ooh, looks like you got company.
Yo, dude, it's Rod. Open up.
The mysterious voice at the door, as he just identified himself, is Ron. He's your best and only friend going on 4 years now ever since you both wore that same shirt at that one bar at that one time. Bro.
Yeah, guy friendships are that simple. Now Ron, he's always had this weird obsession with end of the world scenarios like this, so I'm sure he will use this situation as a big ol' I told you so. I told you so. See? Of course I had to invite myself over, but dude, we gotta get a move on. It's been a few weeks with Ron, and things are going pretty well. Luckily, with like 3/4 of the population dying in gridlock, resources are still pretty plentiful. You've both managed to hunker down in a grocery store, which is conveniently constructed next to a home improvement facility. That's pretty neat. But let's face it, humans are opportunists, so if there's chaos and confusion, people will take advantage. Sure, some looting and stuff happened, but oddly enough, the majority of things taken were TVs and shoes. And that's lucky for you, since those things are, as far as I know, inedible. Sure, you'd figure that the government might have helped out by now, but when the emergency services budget has been diverted to researching the long-term effects of Asmongold political commentary, there's not much for wiggle room.
Yeah, this is gonna keep getting worse.
As for food, you want to prioritize anything that is sealed, especially with high water content, as they are the least likely to be affected by radiation since radiation can't swim. Things like canned meats, canned vegetables, and oh no way, they even have... Since this grocery store has backup generators, refrigerated and frozen foods are still on the menu. If you can figure out a way to safely cook them, of course. Rats. Uh-oh, looks like the store manager isn't too happy about you fingering his foods.
You'll have to pay for that, you know.
Time for a choice. What's a plumber's favorite drug? Huh? Crack. You said you weren't gonna. I lied. Ron, do you think we're gonna make it out of here? Of course, dude. Why do you ask? I just think we should be making progress away from here, away from all of this chaos and this radiation. I mean, sure, but it's all radioactive out there. Actually, all the radiation is being blown northwest of here. As long as you keep to the southeast for a few hundred miles, you should be good. So why haven't you left? Do you really care? No. Well, you probably want radiation suits like these ones just in case though, but these are for me and my son here. Can we have those? Hell no. Please? Okay, nice work. You've managed to figure out a way to safety, but you can't go unprepared. You're gonna need to find some equipment for the journey ahead. You shimmy your way over to the hardware place next door to look for supplies. With some luck, you're able to find some cloth, 3 logs, and a rope. With some elbow grease and a bit of know-how, you're able to craft these into something useful. That should work. You also grab a sweet axe as a precaution, placing all of the items in your back pocket to save precious time on animation. You ready to go, Ron? Let's do it. Oh, that needs some WD-40. Yep. You traverse through the remnants of the town and make your way towards the southeast. On your way, you pass by dozens of poor unfortunate souls who have succumbed to the effects of radiation poisoning. This stuff is not fun in the slightest. If your unprotected body gets absolutely assaulted by ionizing radiation, you're in for a world of hurt. Literally. I'm sure you're familiar with the famous Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. The firefighters and operators during that event learned very quickly that death can be an invisible beast. After generous exposure to radiation emanating from the nuclear plant's reactor core, these men endured unfathomable pain and suffering for weeks. Immediate symptoms included radiation burns, intense nausea and vomiting, headaches, and diarrhea. Those that could be were rushed to the Pripyat hospital, where they had to be stripped of their contaminated clothes that continued to bombard their bodies with radiation, even while being miles from the original source. Those clothes were abandoned in the hospital's basement and are still down there emitting levels of radiation to this day, albeit not nearly as dangerous. Over the following weeks, these men's bodies severely deteriorated, forming painful burns and bleeding blisters with extreme hair loss and a constant state of confusion and dizziness. In the end, 28 firefighters who responded to the Chernobyl disaster died of acute radiation syndrome. But there's nothing cute about being turned into a human hemorrhoid. Now luckily, you're past the point of this being a problem for you. It's probably best if you trail off from the beaten path. After all, you never know if any of the other survivors you encounter will be friend or foe. You trek through the woods for a few days, living off of various non-perishables and bottled water from your convenient off-screen inventory. But supplies are starting to run a bit low and you think you might need to start foraging. But hold on, remember that nuclear contamination can spread far beyond the original site, even if it isn't directly downwind. So animals, plants, and water sources can still be contaminated. So unless you carry a reverse osmosis filtration plant between your cheeks, you're SOL. Looks like you need to search elsewhere for food and water. But it also looks like Ron is about to be in danger.
Oh, look at this little fella. You gotta come over here and take a look at this little powder puff. He's so dang cute.
Ron?
What? Oh, shit.
There! A cave! Bears hate caves!
Good enough for me. You might want to hurry up a bit.
We made it. You okay, Ron? Ron? Are you okay? You take the time to mourn the loss of your fallen friend, but the solemn silence is broken by a noise deeper in the cave. You even notice some light and are determined to investigate. Now, under normal circumstances, you really shouldn't be wandering willy-nilly into a cave like this. It's a surefire way to end up trapped or wedged in some narrow cave system dubbed Satan's Prolapse. But there is an angry bear outside that just murdered your friend, so this might be a better alternative. Let's see what lies ahead. Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hello? Hello? I hate cultists.
Well, that was certainly a choice. Looks like you're the new owner of a weird little worshipping cave. Probably some sweet loot here. You scavenge and swipe what you can. Some food, materials, but something else catches your eye. Well, that's definitely magical, but certainly evil. And there's an inscription underneath. Survival you have learned, so now you must return. Just flip me thrice, but some advice, that witch will need to burn. Are you really gonna trust some evil artifact you just found in a cultist's cave? Why not? Alley-oop. I'm back. Hey, Cityville Nuclear Power Plant? We have a witch problem. No, this isn't a prank. Hey, Ron, do you want to come over?
Where's the lamb sauce?
The worst jobs in history. If you ever think your job's crappy, try having to plunge into a pit of literal human doo-doo feces every single night. Way back in the day in good old England, some daring men made a career out of wading through human excrement. So-called gong farmers were tasked with draining out cesspits filled to the brim with offensive butt slop. The profession had existed for centuries, but it saw its height between the years of 1485 and 1603, also known as the Tudor period. Oi, I got a shooter for you. Since this was way before the invention of the turlet, people were content with just slamming their cheeks down in a public latrine to pinch off a quick loaf. The other problem was the lack of availability of somewhere to go. Towards the end of the 14th century, it's estimated that there was only one public bathroom per 2,000 people. Plus, keep in mind that all of that human waste was just piling up in a literal stone-lined hole in the ground, so you were just dropping logs onto a mountain of timber. The local government, realizing that this horrid threat to public health was fermenting beneath everyone's feet, took action to allow the construction of private outhouses and latrines in residential areas as a way to disperse the smelly sewage. It didn't work all that well. So with dookie levels rising, help was needed to drain the pits. Enter the gong farmer. The term gong deriving from an Old English term meaning to go. They were also referred to as the much more mysterious and cooler sounding title of nightmen, as the only time that they were allowed to perform their duties was under the shroud of night, and that really sucked. There were no flashlights, spotlights, or illumination of any kind. You just had to hope that the moon was shining brightly to light your way through the filth. The nightmen would enter these cesspits and drain the contents using buckets and shovels. Excrement was loaded into barrels and carted off to be dumped near the River Thames. Don't worry, it was used as fertilizer later. Maybe. These men would be knee-deep, waist-deep, even neck-deep in the stuff, which had its own risks, the first and foremost being asphyxiation. Cesspits were often enclosed spaces with little to no ventilation, so the buildup of noxious and toxic gases was a very real threat. Although rare, a gong farmer could pass out from a lack of fresh air and drown in the waste. Another risk was poor maintenance. Cesspits were typically drained as needed, which, depending on the size of the thing, could be up to 2 years between sloppy scoops. Since these pits just sat there and rotted, it was common for stone walls to collapse in on the farmers while they harvested their crops. Any scrapes or bumps would certainly get infected, which could only lead to a painful death. But these high risks were met with high reward. Since the job was less than desirable, gong farmers made quite a healthy living, about 6 pence a day. Now, I'm not quite sure what that is in non-silly sounding money, but sounds pretty good. Problem is though, gong farmers perpetually reeked from their labors and were only permitted to live in certain areas of the city, with most of the public actively avoiding them and, well, treating them like crap. Now, if you're looking for a soul-crushing, body-breaking job that pays next to nothing, you're an idiot. But I could recommend that you apply for the occupation of chimney sweep. These services were all the rage in, you guessed it, England's Tudor period. But the job has existed for hundreds of years. Rapid urbanization led to the construction of a lot of buildings, and each one of them suckers needs a source of heat. You gotta keep them English toesies nice and warm during the miserable grey winter months until the arrival of the miserable grey summer months. So a lot of fireplaces and chimneys were built to meet that demand. You do know how a fireplace works, right? Make fire make heat and smoke go up through chimney and blow out the top. But all of that burning of wood and coal creates lots of icky carbon-heavy flammable deposits that build up within the chimney. Big problem, cause if that's not properly cleared out, then things can just go, and there goes not only your house, but a few neighbors' houses as collateral damage. Well, the higher-ups didn't like the risk of their kingdom going up in smoke at any given time, so they mandated that chimneys must be swept at least 4 times a year or face heavy fines. Thus, the employment of chimney sweeps became critical. The problem, though, is that chimneys at the time weren't exactly designed for human entry and cleaning. Bugger. Most flue networks in the building were grouped together on the roof, but could have sharp turns as they angled out towards their respective fireplaces or furnaces. To make matters even worse, regulations shrunk flue sizes down to as little as 9 by 9 inches. This made it nearly impossible for full-grown men to slip through the cracks. The solution? Children. Really young children. Adorable, wide-eyed orphans were yoinked from poor houses and taken on as apprentices called climbing boys, with opportunities to one day grow into master sweepers themselves, if they lived that long. If it wasn't obvious, chimney sweeping was extremely dangerous, especially for the little limber lads. Boys as young as 6 years old were sent up chimneys and told to get scrubbing. The physical dangers were abundant, as several children had died from getting stuck or horribly burned from scaling the scalding bricks. Keep in mind that these fireplaces were almost always in use, so those chimneys were hot and ready like a carry-out pizza. Now, if the cramming didn't kill you, the scrubbing would. Soot and creosote, the organic carbonaceous byproducts of burning wood and coal, are carcinogenic. So if you're trapped in a confined space just scrub-a-dub-dubbing away while sucking up hits of cancer-causing black powder all day day, things are not going to turn out well for you. But it actually wasn't your lungs that you needed to worry about. No, it was your balls. Scrotal squamous cell carcinoma, also known as chimney sweeps carcinoma or just straight up scrotal cancer, was a death sentence. Something I didn't mention until now was that the young children, as a way to fit easier into the narrow hot chimneys, often went commando. No shirt, no shoes, no pants, but all service. The constant exposure to soot and such led to the development of tumors on their nethers. Once developed, they were lucky if they had a few years left in them. Sure, your sack is out of whack, but damn, that chimney's clean. You've probably heard of the radium girls, young women of the workforce that would paint luminous numbers and hands onto timepieces in the early 1900s. Well, this is similar. Towards the end of the 19th century, matchmaking was a pretty lucrative business. Not like pairing couples up, but making literal matches. By the late 1800s, there were about 25 matchmaking factories across Great Britain, employing over 4,000 chaps and chapettes. The process, as with most industries at the time, involved working with some nasty chemicals. The flavor of the day here was white phosphorus, an unstable compound that burned fiercely when ignited. You know, perfect for the few seconds that you would need to set something ablaze. On top of being both easily ignitable and violently reactive with oxygen, it had the triple whammy of also being extremely toxic. Of all matchmaking jobs, roughly half were involved in the direct handling of white phosphorus, with over 80% of the phosphorus fingerers being young women. These women would come to be known as matchstick girls. Day in and day out, these women were tasked with packaging the dipped matchsticks, with an entire workforce handling as many as 10 million across a 10-hour shift, meeting the demand of the 250 million matches being burned in Britain every single day. Remember that fire is what got people through the day. Need to cook? Fire. Need to keep warm? Fire. Need to see in the dark? Fire. Need to shrink your overhead? Fire. It was the biggest blessing humanity has ever discovered, and you can now summon it out of a little box in your pocket. The obvious problem is that fiddling with all of those fickle phosphorus fumes physically fucked you up. It was very common for both men and women to form phosphoric necrosis of the jaw. The condition, nicknamed Fossy jaw, developed after the long-term exposure to phosphorus fumes. Initial symptoms included simple toothaches, which evolved into complete tooth loss, abscesses, swelling of the gums, and complete necrosis of the jaw. To put it simply, your jaw rotted off. If you did get the jaw rot, there was about a 1 in 5 chance that the rest of your body would be rotting not long after from contracting an even worse condition known as death. In 1888, over 1,400 matchstick girls, fed up with this blatant disregard for their safety, decided to strike, demanding better pay, working conditions, and abolition of unfair fines and penalties. The strike lasted for 2 weeks before demands were met and accepted. 20 years later, in 1908, the British House of Commons completely banned the use of toxic white phosphorus in favor of the much safer and less toxic red phosphorus, which is what we use in matches today, but not in the match head, on the striking pad. So remember to light one up for the matchstick girls. If you think your job's exhausting, try hauling an entire freaking ship up a river with your bros. These are burlaks, or barge haulers. They hauled barges. Typically dirt poor peasants just looking for enough coin to eat for a week, these men were tasked with strapping on a strap and using whatever strength they had left in them to pull in ships from the Caspian Sea all the way up the Volga River in the days of the Russian Empire. Since ship traffic was near constant thanks to strong trade, burlaks were in high demand to carefully guide the vessels up the Volga. But why couldn't the ships just sail up the river, you might ask? Because the Volga flows outward towards the Caspian Sea, and there were rarely favorable winds to propel a ship up the river, lest you risk beaching your entire ship on the banks. So why not hire a bunch of exhausted and desperate poor people to do the work instead? Whoa, slow down fellas, there's no need for us to be Russian. Depending on the load size, burlak groups could range from just a few men up to 150 fellas pulling a single ship. But there was a moment of respite for these workers. See, one advantage to working in the Russian Empire was the cold winters. Can't exactly move ships upstream when the waterways are completely frozen over. So burlaks were seasonal, working dawn until dusk, thaw till frost. But since the combination of being poor and not working meant certain death, the men would pick up odd jobs in the winter to barely scrape by.
Hey, I make a duck. Smudgy, smudgy.
At the beginning of the 19th century, it is estimated that about 600,000 burlaks worked in the Russian Empire, but the evolution of ship technology and the invention of the steam-powered ship rendered the job obsolete. By the end of the 19th century, the burlak profession had vanished over the horizon. Now I know what you're thinking, so stop it. This has nothing to do with milking your own snake or giving little pinches to little snake nips, which don't exist. Snakes aren't mammals. The job of a snake milker was to extract their venom from their fangs. He looks cute, right? Think again. Snake venom was highly coveted for use in early warfare as a biological weapon, granting you the ability to proc tick damage over time to your enemies if you weren't able to finish them off yourself. Perhaps the best weapons of choice to get slathered in the stuff were arrows. Lethality of arrows varied greatly. Take one in the skull? Yeah, sure, you're dead as a doornail. But take one in a less critical spot like an arm or a leg, assuming you don't sever an artery, and you might just live to see another day. But that all goes out the window if the arrow tip was dipped in some venomous drip. Quite a few civilizations have been noted for using envenomed or poisoned arrows throughout history. You've got the Khoisan people of southern Africa who have been using poisoned arrows for thousands of years in hunting large prey, and the Harmatilians who used viper venom against an invading Alexander the Great. But no army employed the use of snake venom better than the Scythians. Also duking it out against Alexander the Great, the Scythians developed their own iconic poison for warfare. Combining not only viper venom, but also putrefied human blood and excrement, even minor scrapes from their weapons were lethal. So on top of dealing with being envenomed, you also dealt with the horrors of gangrene and tetanus. So with all that said and done, yeah, snake milkers. Like I said, it was their job to wrangle and wrestle up enough snakes to meet the demand of entire armies. But luckily, this wasn't a time for catch and release practices. Kill the snakes, take their venom. That's the job. Of course, that is easier said than done. By nature, snakes are shy little fellas and pretty hard to find. Chances are you get struck before you even noticed one. One catch of their fangs is enough for it to be game over. Snake milkers were considered lucky if they even managed to survive a single round of collecting.
I think it's time for a quick science lesson.
Venoms can be sorted into three main types: neurotoxic, hemotoxic, cytotoxic, yikes. Neurotoxins strike and destroy all your nerves. You're agonized and paralyzed as you can observe. Hemotoxins target all your healthy blood, thinning down or clotting up, so now you're done for, bud. Cytotoxins focus on killing all your cells, so you can probably guess that you won't be doing well. Just avoid snakes and you'll be doing fine. I know you fellas and fellettes just love a good rhyme. So to close this chapter out, yes, snake milkers still exist nowadays, though only for medical research and developing antivenom rather than biological warfare. Or so we think. Imagine getting ready to charge onto a battlefield to either invade a country or defend your own. You see your fellow soldiers gearing up for battle with their trusty firearms, and you're given a drum. Ugh. I gotta fight. Drummers, believe it or not, were a critical part of warfare in the days of yore. Since there were no such things as radios or more instantaneous methods of communication, drummer boys were employed and trained to maintain order on the battlefield, signaling commands, attacks, retreats, and everything in between. Peaking in popularity during the American Civil War, drummer boys were typically in their teenage years or young adulthood, though some more famous drummer boys were much younger. Little Charlie King of the Union Army died in battle at the age of just 13, being the youngest casualty in the Battle of Antietam. Itty Bitty Johnny Clem ran away from home and was taken in by the Union Army as a drummer boy at the ripe old age of 9. Just a few years later, the little fella fought in the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863 at the age of 12, where he shot and killed a Confederate soldier.
What you gonna do? Shoot?
He was promoted to sergeant, eventually retiring from the United States Army in 1915 as a brigadier general. But that's a rare occurrence. In reality, it would have gone more like this. Despite what people may think, drummer boys did not lead troops into battle. That would be stupid. Instead, they would relay commands from behind soldier lines, though they were still known to be valuable targets. If you break the communication line, you break down the army. Outside of combat, drummer boys had a wealth of other responsibilities, such as carrying messages between units, assisting battlefield surgeons with amputations, carting the wounded up the field, fetching supplies, or burying the dead. They very rarely carried weapons of their own, so if they had to defend themselves in the heat of battle, they were pretty shit out of luck. If you wanted to be one of the most influential people in all of England but don't have a drop of royal blood in you, you'd want to squeeze into the role of the groom of the stool, a job requiring you to get up real close and personal with the king or queen at the time. Look, we all have to go once or 12 times a day, so someone as prestigious and important as the king is gonna need help doing so. I mean, imagine feeling the sudden urge to blow out your britches, but you have to fight through said britches to accomplish the mission. Grooms of the stool assisted the monarch with any labors regarding biological movements. This included helping the removal of clothing, preparation of the lavish and luxurious royal ship box, and the removal of the splendiferous solids, but not before their proper examination. Yeah, that's right. Grooms of the stool were not only tasked with cleaning up the royal slurry, but making sure that the passings were healthy, taking notes of any abnormalities in appearance or frequency. These notes would be passed on to the king's personal physician to diagnose any possible ailments. Well, that's not very helpful, is it? After the log was sent down the river, the groom of the stool would also assist in the cleanup effort, either by handing the king his own personal cleaning cloth or by taking up wiping duties themselves. Now you might think that this job sucked, but it was actually highly coveted and well respected, as grooms of the stool had access to the king outside of the public eye, allowing for valuable private conversations. Commonly high-ranking nobles or politicians, grooms of the stool were known to have influence in many formal rulings, laws, or personal life. So that Anne Boleyn chick's hot, right? No. The first documented groom of the stool dates all the way back to 1495 under King Henry VII. The role continued to evolve over the years to the title of groom of the stole, though they were more so referred to as either the gentleman or gentlewoman of the bedchamber, depending on the monarch in charge, with responsibilities eventually focusing solely on the king or queen's wardrobe. The position was held for over 400 years until being formally discontinued under King Edward VII in 1901.
The silliest deaths in history. Sometimes it's your own pride that can get the best of you. This is Hans Steininger, and this is his beard. Hey, my eyes are up here. Looking like the wisest wizard in the world, Hans was a public spectacle in the 16th century and also a well-respected politician. Cause, I mean, come on, who are you gonna vote for? Majestic and marvelous beard boy Hans, or the lame and lackluster clean-shaven Franz? Und that is how I will be lowering taxes while simultaneously providing affordable healthcare and housing for all.
Alright, but where's your beard?
I don't have one.
This guy stinks!
But behind that big bushel of bristles beats a kind heart, one that legitimately cared for his town and its people. So much so that Hans was elected as mayor for 6 consecutive terms for the town of Braunau am Inn, a town that resides on the border between modern-day Austria and Germany. It's also the birthplace of another famous facial hair haver, albeit far less loved by history, but that's another story. Measuring in at over 4.5 feet in length, Hans's big-ass beard was his defining feature, and was certainly a testament to his patience and care in many aspects in his life. If you can brush your beard, you can untangle legislative issues. If you can oil up your whiskers, you can lubricate the political machine. So it goes without saying that cosmetology and political science are of equal value. At least from a college degree standpoint. However, Hans's biggest asset would be his downfall, quite literally. On September 28, 1567, a fire broke out in the town, which was a much bigger threat back then than it is today. Since the extent of firefighting tactics were just pathetic pails of water, a single small fire could reduce your whole town to cinders real quick. Hans, who usually tucked his beloved beard into a leather pouch for safekeeping and uninhibited travel, let his lusciously long locks whimsically whip in the wind as he ran to help with the fire. Scuttling down some stairs in a panic, Hans had accidentally slammed a piggy right on his own facial pubes, causing him to slip and trip down the entire staircase. He snaps his neck, and the town was devastated. Not by the fire, but by the loss of their beloved mayor. Before being buried, the townsfolk had Hans's beard gently removed and chemically preserved, immortalizing his legacy. The forever facial hair is still on display in a museum in the town today. You know his ghost is pissed, though. Ever have an extreme case of the sleepy ha-has where you find anything and everything to be complete comedic gold to the point of not being able to even breathe? Now try to imagine this soggy scoop of Cheerios doing that. This is Chrysippus, a rather influential Greek Stoic philosopher in the 3rd century BC. In case you don't peruse that corner of YouTube, Stoicism is the philosophy that you only ever need to focus on what you can control in your life. Anything reasonably outside of that control, Hakunas Matatis, not my problemas. Which is a pretty solid philosophy, especially in this age of doom and gloom social media designed to make you perpetually paranoid and pissed off. Chrysippus was also a huge proponent of logical reasoning, having created an original system of propositional logic, stuff like if, then, and or statements that we use to describe the world around us today. For example, if you are not subscribed to this channel, then you're dead to me. Simple logic. The basic idea is that any and all things happen for a reason. Well, I'm sure Chrysippus would have a hard time understanding the logic and reasoning surrounding his rather untimely death. According to legend, Chrysippus, at the fermented old age of 73, got trashed at a feast. In his slizzard state, he had stumbled upon a donkey who was munching on some figs. Registering at least a 6.9 on the ancient Greek comedy scale, the masticating mule was a hilarious sight to behold, prompting Chrysippus to exclaim, quote,
Now give the donkey some pure wine to wash down the figs. This added punchline sent the Lord of Logic over the edge. Chrysippus reportedly hurled himself into a fit of laughter so intense that he had collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Despite some nearby partygoers attempting to help him, he had knocked himself dead with his own joke. But the question is, can you actually die from laughter? Sure you can. It's rare, but medically possible. If you laugh your ass off to the point of it being an uncontrollable fit, that actually puts a lot of stress on your heart. So if you have a weak heart, you're probably going to exacerbate some underlying conditions, leading to a heart attack. You also have the possibility of losing consciousness if you laugh yourself out of breath for long enough. But you have to hear or see something exceptionally funny for that to happen, so don't worry, you're safe here. Now, of course, this recount of events is debated by historians. The guy who documented this particular death was ancient Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, who lived a few hundred years after Chrysippus' death, so he was far from an eyewitness. Diogenes nuts! On top of that, he also wrote an alternative, more mundane account of the comical death, simply writing that Chrysippus died of alcohol poisoning after drinking too much undiluted wine, but I guess he needed to spice some things up for his readers. If there was ever proof that the universe has a cruel sense of humor, then it's the curious case of American lawyer and politician Clement Vallandigham.
Howdy.
Though he resided in the Union state of Ohio during the mid-1800s, Clement was adamantly against the Civil War, calling it, quote, a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war. Which is fine, but being a member of the Copperhead faction of the anti-war Democrats, Clement was a very vocal Confederate sympathizer, speaking out against President Lincoln and the abolition of slavery, to which Lincoln was all and sent him to the South to live amongst his Confederate companions in 1863. Clement, who was clearly not about that life, snuck aboard a ship and shipped himself off to Canada before sneaking back to his home state of Ohio to perform rather inconsequential political mumbo-jumbo for the next few years. But after the war was over, Clement attempted to run on political platforms while still advocating for slavery. However, he suddenly switched his views with the Democratic New Departure policy of 1865, which basically 180'd the Democratic Party's stance on slavery once they realized that it fell out of favor in the public's eye. So, being branded as a no-good slavery supporter for life meant the figurative death of his political career. Instead, he turned to a career in law, which would soon lead to his literal death. On June 17, 1871, Vallandigham met his demise while defending his client, Thomas McGeehan, a young fella accused of shooting and killing one Tommy Myers. Clement claimed that Myers had, in fact, not been murdered, but accidentally shot himself with his own gun while getting up to stand. Clement vowed that he could demonstrate this before the court, proving McGeehan's innocence. And so he did. Now, when reenacting a scene that results in someone accidentally blowing a hole through their own tummy, you want to make sure that you have safety measures in place that would physically prevent you from doing the same thing. Clement didn't do that. Instead, he had mistakenly used a loaded pistol. While demonstrating the scene as Myers, Clement attempted to draw the seemingly harmless firearm from his coat pocket as he stood up. And he blew a hole through his own tummy, just like Myers. Clement Vallandigham died just 12 hours later from his injuries. The verdict? Not guilty. McGeehan was acquitted and was a free man. Until he was murdered a few years later, that is. You can tempt death all you like, but eventually, he's gonna get what's his. That's what big old Bobby Leach found out in 1926. Born in itty-bitty Britain, England in 1858, Leach grew up to be quite the daredevil. Unfortunately, most of Bobby's early life is lost to time, completely shrouded in mystery. We do know that around the 1880s, he had left boring old England for a more exhilarating life in the States. Apparently an excellent swimmer, Leach eventually landed a gig as a professional high diver with the greatest show on earth, the Barnum and Bailey Circus. There, he performed daringly dangerous feats in front of thousands of eager onlookers. This had quenched the adrenaline-thirsty void in his life for a while, but eventually he retired from this circus life at the age of 50 in order to extend his life expectancy a bit. But that logic was tossed aside rather quickly, as in the early 1900s, Bobby decided to settle down as a humble businessman at Niagara Falls.
Blimey, that's a proper waterfall, isn't it?
Initially content with just opening up a restaurant, Leach noticed the ever-increasing tourists flocking from afar to see a bunch of water spill over a cliff. So, this gave him an idea. The daredevil was back. Between 1906 and 1911, Leach performed various stunts around the falls, including parachuting from the nearby Honeymoon Bridge to the river below. Over the years, Leach continued to push the envelope, coming up with more and more dangerous stunts to draw larger and larger crowds. Eventually, he faced his biggest challenge, the falls themselves. And on July 25th, 1911, entombed in a customized giant metal barrel, Leach took the plunge. And survived. Sure, he had gashed his forehead, broken his jaw, and all of his kneecaps, but he was still kicking. Bobby Leach became the second person to survive the trip, right behind 63-year-old Annie Taylor. After recovering in the hospital for several months, Leach became a celebrity. Over the next several years, he had plans to make a second bound over the falls, but it never came to be. Why? Well, because in 1926 he went and slipped on a dang orange peel, snapping his leg in half, which went and got infected with gangrene, ultimately killing him a few days later.
Remember that death always gets the last laugh.
Having served the shortest presidential term in United States history, you know something must have gone down. Well, it was President William Henry Harrison's health bar. The withering president had a pretty impressive career before assuming office. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1791 at the age of 18 and quickly rose through the ranks, serving in the American Indian Wars, which sought to expand U.S. territory further west against native tribes, which they did. Satisfied with his service, Harrison decided to retire from the military at 25 and toss his hat in the ring for a career in politics. Recognized for his leadership skills on the battlefield, then President Guy John Adams gave Harrison control over the territory of Indiana as governor, with the goal of expanding that territory for statehood eligibility. One consequence of this territorial expansion was the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, which only further displaced natives from the area in order to allow more settlers to, well, settle. This success cemented Harrison's legacy, as Indiana would eventually become its own state in 1816. But leading military campaigns from afar, that's boring as shit. Harrison missed being in the middle of the action, so he came out from his military retirement to fight in the War of 1812, serving as a major general for the US Army against the smelly redcoats, who weren't too happy seeing the US's throbbing expansion. A bunch of people died, and the war ended in pretty much a stalemate. But the outcome solidified the US as a world power, being able to at least defend itself from a foreign power. This really boosted national morale and pride, and with no restrictions put in place, the US just kept on manifesting that destiny in the coming years. Now back in a time of peace and having successfully satisfied his war boner, Harrison fell back into politics, serving in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and eventually running for president. His opponent was 8th President Martin Van Buren, whose first term experienced an economic depression with the Panic of 1837. Of course, Van Buren was given the blame for the economic downturn, even though it began over a month before he was even in office. The economy stagnated, unemployment rose, and the people were properly pissed. So it's no surprise that when seeking re-election, it was now Harrison who would be the favorite to win. Aww. Harrison won in a landslide, 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60, but that wouldn't matter in about a month. Elected in 1841 at the age of 68, Harrison was getting on in his years. Either a stubborn old goat or a complete idiot, he had the habit of being extremely underprepared for the weather. For example, he delivered his inaugural speech in the bitter cold and rain for 2 hours straight, with no overcoat or weather-appropriate clothes.
Connected with the subject is the character of the currency. The idea of making it exclusively metallic, however well intended, appears to me to be fraught with...
Oh, this is gonna suck. Harrison continued to endure exposure to the elements over the next few weeks, eventually contracting a deadly case of pneumonia. Despite his doctors jacking him to the tits with drugs and relying on good old-fashioned bloodletting, Harrison died on April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after being elected. When you were a kid, did you ever try jumping off of a sofa using a blanket as a makeshift parachute, but you failed to calculate if the blanket had the proper coefficient of drag necessary to minimize your acceleration due to gravity, leaving you crashing to the floor in a possible concussion? Just me? Well, take that scenario and scale it up to adult size, except this is your blanket, and this is your couch. Meet Franz Reichelt, the mastermind behind the parachute suit prototype. An Austro-Hungarian tailor and inventor, Franz became hyper-fixated on developing a sort of wearable parachute. He had identified a gap in the market with the rise of humanity's newest invention, the powered aircraft. Seeing reports of pilots forced to launch themselves out of their airborne contraptions if things went south, Franz vowed to come up with a solution to save lives. So he got to work in 1910 with some initial designs, testing the prototypes by strapping them onto makeshift dummies and hucking them off of a 5-story ledge. Surprisingly, the dummies managed to hit the ground at less than fatal speeds. Not bad. But there was a problem. The prototype weighed 150 pounds. And no pilot's gonna lug all that extra weight onto an aircraft, even if it would potentially save their life. But Franz would not give up. After all, you have to fail many times before you succeed. But it did help that there was also some monetary encouragement. Turns out that France's Aeronautic Club held a parachute-esque design competition which offered a cash prize to the tune of 10,000 francs. Considering that the average wage of an unskilled French laborer at the time was only a few francs a day, that prize was nothing to sneeze at. Over the next year, Reichelt was unable to replicate his initial success with any of the lighter redesigns. But to his logic, it wasn't a design problem, it was a height problem. Anyone who has even taken a basic physics course knows that this is a bad idea. You fall exponentially faster the longer you're airborne thanks to acceleration due to gravity. But what's a bunch of stupid science shit gonna do to stop an avid inventor from fulfilling his dream and lining his pockets? Nothing. But the pavement will. But Franz, determined to test his designs from a higher height, pleaded with the Parisian prefecture of police to allow him to run an experiment from the Eiffel Tower. Despite numerous rejections, they eventually gave in. On the bitter cold morning of February 4th, 1912, and to the surprise of everyone, Franz arrived on site in his dumpy-looking parachute suit. Now, the police only gave Franz permission to perform this stunt on the grounds that dummies would be used, not that he would be doing the jumping himself. This guy was so confident in his invention, boasting to news journalists of how successful it was gonna be. But apparently the police didn't feel like stopping him, so after a bunch of preparations, Reichelt made the leap, but his parachute suit failed to properly deploy, so the poor fella plummeted 187 feet to his death, achieving nothing but a Franz-shaped dent in the cement. The silliest deaths in history. Part 2. In a world of constant scientific revolution and innovation, it's required that any new theories be put to the test with reliable and repeatable proofs. Otherwise, you're about as useful as a flat earther. But sometimes that proof puts people in harm's way. Take, for instance, one Jesse William Lazier. This handsome block of cheddar was an American physician in the late 1800s, though he did live to see the new century, just not for very long. But we'll get to that in a bit. Growing from a well-to-do boy into a well-to-do man, Lazier had a passion for helping the ill and minimizing all of the icky sickies that had plagued humanity throughout history. So he took that passion and put it to good use, receiving his doctorate in medicine from Columbia University in 1892. Upgrading himself from graduate to practicing physician in 1895, Lazier focused his studies on two major diseases, the infectious malaria and the deadly yellow fever, both of which were stirring up all kinds of problems in the late 1800s, the worst of which being that people were dying. But exactly how these diseases were being spread so easily, particularly in the southern United States and in the Caribbean, remained a mystery, for a few more years at least. Well, that's not exactly true. You see, about 14 years earlier, Cuban public health professional disease researcher guy Carlos Finlay came up with a theory. He proposed that some diseases, particularly yellow fever, could be transmitted through the bite of a single infected mosquito. It's a rather simple theory. An itty-bitty mosquito bites an infected monkey, acquires the yellow fever, flies away, finds a healthy human, gives the suck and leaves behind yellow fever, and the cycle continues. Now, if you've ever spent more than 2 seconds in the American South, you know just how bad them little shits can get. So if there's a few infected people and a lot of mosquitoes, things are gonna spread faster than a bad joke at a dad convention. Oh, come on, I'm hungry. He said it. Finlay laid out his research and presented his nido-mosquito theory to the scientific community, opting for control over the mosquito population to minimize the spread. And they all laughed at him. All them stupid science bitches ridiculed and mocked Finlay's theory, brushing it off as complete nonsense. But now we fast forward more than a decade, and a very confident Lazier was willing to put that theory to the test. On himself.
Right here's an infected skater, and here's an uninfected me. So, if it bites me and I get infected, well, there you go.
And so, in September of 1900, Lazier was deliberately bitten by an infected mosquito. He contracted yellow fever and died several days later.
But his sacrifice would not be in vain, as it confirmed Finlay's theory, subsequently revolutionizing the control of yellow fever, including controlling the mosquito population. The age of exploration saw a lot of exploring from many a capable sea captain. But amongst the Columbuses and Marco Polos of history, some have fallen through the cracks, their deeds and accomplishments forgotten to time, or just not important enough for people to care. Johnny Kendrick was one such captain. Ever since growing up aboard Papa Kendrick's whaling vessel in his teenage years, John had a love of the sea, which explains the vast success he found in his later years. This guy was more American than he strapped apple pie asking for a tip. A member of the American Sons of Liberty, Kendrick personally took part in the famous Boston Tea Party, hucking countless crates of precious British life fuel into the harbor. He also commanded a privateer ship during the American Revolution, attacking and capturing British warships with his crew of 104 men, even going as far as helping convince the French to join the fight. After helping America get its independence, Kendrick took to the seas once more, this time on a more exploratory venture. Teaming up with famous explorer ship-sailing captain fellow Robert Gray, whom you've probably never heard of, the two bros made history, leading the first US expedition to the Pacific Northwest, where they established a strong fur trade route. This was mainly trading goods like mirrors and knives to purchase sea otter pellets from local natives. Hey, gotta do what you gotta do, you know? Kendrick also made himself at home in Hawaii in the late 1700s. There, he built up a pretty lucrative sandalwood trade hub, harvesting the wood in Hawaii and shipping it off to China, who treasured the luscious lumber for its durability, medicinal and therapeutic properties, and of course, its smell.
Oh, that's good wood.
So Kendrick spent many a year just jamming as much of his wood as he could into China's supple trading ports, skipping back and forth across the Pacific Pond between mainland China and the Hawaiian Islands. But Hawaii, historically speaking, often had a bunch of fighting between chiefs of the different islands. Each chief, understandably enough, wanted to expand their respective territories and influence. Well, when returning to the islands in 1794, Kendrick found Hawaii to be in complete turmoil, with two chiefs duking it out to be the big chief in charge. One of the tribes was being supplied by Captain William Brown, a proper Brit who was willing to get some land for the British crown. Kendrick replied he too supplied a chief of great renown, and put to the test Kendrick did his best to smack the captain down. So in December of 1794, a battle commenced with Captain Brown supporting the chief of Oahu and Kendrick supporting the chief of Kauai. How cute. The tropical tussle ended with Kendrick's side being victorious, inspiring him to celebrate the only way a true American knows how: by firing off loud guns. As planned, Kendrick's ship had ignited a volley of cannon fire. Although his side had lost, Captain Brown, determined to uphold proper British etiquette, agreed to discharge a volley of his own cannons in Kendrick's honor.
Oh, this turtle soup is to die for.
Well, that's what you get for slurping your soup. Ugh, turns out in a complete honest mistake, Captain Brown forgot to unload shot from one of his cannons before firing it off. Some historical accounts claim that grape shot tore through Kendrick's cabin, creating complete chaos and quickly killing the competent captain as he crunched on a collation of consumables.
Oh, sorry about that. It's completely my fault.
Yep, that Jack Daniel, the two first-name having freak who founded the famous Jack Daniel's Tennessee Whiskey Company. You know, that succulent spirit that did, will, or is getting you through those tough college days or life in general. That's the one. Well, little Jackie Boy was born in Tennessee in the mid-1800s as the youngest of 10, mainly because his birth was the one that sent his beloved mother skyward. Very sad. Now, unfortunately, not much is known about Jack's early life because them town records don't went caught fire. Most of the insight that we do have into Jack's life actually comes from the Jack Daniel's Company historical records. Teeny tiny Jack, the youthful entrepreneur that he was, yearned for work at the ripe old age of 8. The man to answer Jack's call was this guy, Dan Call, a preacher, a screecher, and one distilling creature. And of course, it would be here that Jack would find his calling. Something about Jack caught Dan's eye, and he saw real potential in the little tyke.
This boy's gonna make a fine whiskey one day, I tell you what.
And so, according to company history, an 8-year-old Jack began learning the art and science of distillation from one Nathan Green, a master distiller and slave under Dan Call.
Fast forward several years, and Dan hit a crossroad. Given an ultimatum by his wife, Dan had to choose between his relationship with his tasty spirits or the Holy Spirit. The Reverend chose his Lord and Savior, saving his soul and his liver in the process. In that choice, Dan had sold his prized distillery to none other than his favorite pupil, Jack Daniel, whose first act as new owner was to hire on his friend and mentor Nathan Green as the company's master distiller. He also employed Nathan's 2 adult sons and, later down the line, his grandsons. Now, the Jack Daniels website really emphasizes that Jack never owned slaves. So if you disagree, don't look at me. I'm just a guy on the internet. A man of all business and no pleasure, Jack never married nor had any children of his own. He did, however, take his nephews under his wing to learn the business, eventually handing the distillery down to them in 1907 once his health bar had reached a solid yellow. But it would be a few years later in 1911 before Jack would kick the bucket, or in this case, something much heavier. According to legend, Jack Daniel, now in his 60s or so, had forgotten the combination to a personal safe housing a bunch of valuables like safes are typically designed to do. In his frustration, Jack tried to solve the problem in true US Southerner fashion by putting a boot up its ass. But since a safe has buns of literal steel, Jack instead broke his toe, causing a severe blood infection. Jack Daniel reportedly died of blood poisoning on October 9th, 1911. But is this story true? I don't know. Here's a rather recent one for you. Back in 1993, when the world was witnessing the birth of the internet, Czechoslovakia was checking out, and President Clinton was gearing up to suck or be sucked at his job, Gary Hoy was about to meet his untimely death. An extremely successful business partner and corporate and securities law specialist for the Holden Day Wilson law firm in Toronto, Canada, Gary was living it up. But he would quickly learn that it's a long fall from the top. Gary had a reputation as a very personable guy, always loving to talk to people, share wisdom, and loved cracking a few jokes here and there. But on July 9th, 1993, one of Gary's jokes would fall flat. While attending a reception in the office on a Friday, Gary decided to give a tour of the office to a group of accounting and law students, which of course was a typical routine for Gary's charismatic character. But what happens next would be cemented in the minds of everyone around him. While on the tour of the 24th floor office, Gary decided to whip out his signature move. Boasting about the structural integrity of Canadian architecture and the seemingly unbreakable glass office windows, Gary charged full speed towards one of said windows, a party trick he apparently had performed successfully many times in the past. Typical Gary. But this time, he was also successful. Gary bounced right off of the glass without a hitch, to the applause and laughter of the students. Y'all wanna see me do it again? Yeah! No, not really. Gary was about to push his luck, and a little too hard on the window. Gary charged once more, hitting the glass at a sprint. Now, to his credit, the glass didn't break, but the entire window frame dislodged from its setting, causing Gary to plunge the full 24 stories to his death. The students and various colleagues stood paralyzed and horror-struck after witnessing Gary's fall, not to mention the witnesses on the ground where Hoy's body had landed. Following the incident, many of the firm's lawyers received professional counseling, but some chose to part ways with the company, eventually leading to its full closure in 1996. Talk about having a falling out. Each of us wants to accomplish our own big motivational concrete goals before crossing the eternal finish line. A loving family, traveling the world, subscribing to this channel, which you can do right now. But as the Rolling Stones once said, you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, I forget the rest. Anyway, this is Frank Hayes, and he has his own goal, to win a race. A horse race. Problem is though, he is no professional jockey. A young Irish fella born in Ireland in 1901, Frank grew up as a stable boy and eventually an apprentice horse trainer under James Frayling, a wealthy gent who owned and bred professional racing horses. Paying close attention to Frank's rather small stature, Frayling gave Frank an opportunity to race as a jockey. And he lost. But apparently not too bad, because he was given a second chance in 1923. One small snag in this plan, however, was that Frank was a tad too heavy. Jockeys were required to weigh less than 130 pounds in order to qualify for racing. Ideally, the slimmer and sleeker your jockey is, the less of a burden he is for the horse, allowing for a higher potential speed. Less mass, go fast. And so Frank was given a doozy of a task. Lose 12 pounds in a few days. And that's a big ask for someone already in a healthy weight range, but Frank was determined to strap in the saddle once more. Through what I can only imagine were extremely unhealthy choices, the frail Frank ended up making the cut and was given the thumbs up to participate in the race, though he was nowhere near expected to win, with him and his horse only given 20-1 odds. On June 4th, 1923, Frank mounted his horse named Sweet Kiss and prepared to travel around the track. The racers were off, and Sweet Kiss quickly trailed behind the group. However, in the final stretch, Sweet Kiss apparently kicked in maximum overdrive and managed to close the gap, with Frank appearing locked in, closely hugging the horse's neck. In an extreme upset, Sweet Kiss actually won the race by a pretty respectable lead. But after dropping from a gallop to a canter to a walk, Frank was still closely gripping the steed. Frank Hayes was dead. During the race, Frank's heart gave out, presumably from the extreme and unhealthily fast weight drop sustained to get into the race in the first place. So yeah, Sweet Kiss carried a corpse across the finish line. Frank Hayes photo finished into the great beyond at the age of 22. Or 35, depending on whatever source you read. I know that's a big discrepancy, but welcome to history. Unfortunately, Sweet Kiss, now superstitiously dubbed Sweet Kiss of Death, never ran another race as jockeys refused to mount the mare, fearing a similar fate. So of course, it was the end of her show, and she got her final curtain call.
Yeah, that witch is becoming a real problem. This time, you've been sent into ancient Greece, specifically the classical era. A time of great war and conflict, but also a remarkable leap forward in human civilization. So, can you survive one of humanity's greatest expansions? Or will ancient Greece thermop the floor with you? Let's find out. Greece's classical period began in 510 BC when Athens fell and broke its Hippias, and ended in 323 BC when Alexander was no longer great. As an act of kindness, you've been sent to the funny year. But there's nothing funny about needing to survive. The first thing you need to do is dust yourself off and get your bearings. Maybe a sign or something will help. Well, that's no use. You quickly recall your vast knowledge acquired from countless hours on GeoGuessr and look around for some notable landmarks. After all, some of these buildings still exist in the modern day. Well, there's a familiar sight right over there on the horizon. The Acropolis of Athens. That's in Athens. I must be in Athens. Well, now you know where you are, which means you can start figuring out your next steps for survival. Oops. But first, you need someone to talk to because you're gonna need help. There's never any shame in asking for help. That guy over there seems friendly enough. Although shorter, the dude is absolutely ripped from his labor-intensive chores and looks like he could kill you in one punch, but you approach him anyway. Told you. Now let's assume he's a bit more approachable this time. You begin to ask him a question, but like a monolingual American, you always forget that there are other languages out there besides the freedom one. But you try your best. Here it goes. Hey man, can you help me out here? The man turns his chiseled jaw your way and begins to speak, quickly bombarding you with a bunch of indiscernible mouth sounds that completely fry your brain. But luckily, the words have been displayed in a big old bubble next to his head. Look at all them silly letters. Wait a minute, you say, scratching your chin. I've seen these letters before. Just then, you get a flashback to your college girlfriend's sorority dorm where you found the Euclidean letters, just as you were finding Herclidean. Don't kid yourself. You were doing math homework, you goober. Unfortunately, you come to the realization that knowing just a few letters doesn't mean jack shit in terms of understanding a whole language. Now, some of you modern Greeks out there might lift your hairy arms and say, "Ha, I can speak Greek, I'd survive." Well, you're wrong. Ancient Greek is completely different from modern Greek with completely different tones, vocal inflections, and pronunciations across several regional dialects. Ancient Greeks wouldn't understand a word of modern Greek, so you'd have no real advantage. Needless to say, you're not going to be communicating anytime soon, at least not orally. You begin attempting some charades as a way to express your needs. Too bad all of your wacky waving is perceived as a threat. Man, that's twice. Since you just insulted a random citizen and are an obvious outsider, you're arrested and sold into slavery. Looks like you've been slammed to the bottom of the societal barrel. But what did you expect? Speaking of society, like any society in history, ancient Greece operated under a hierarchy. Since you just got dunked into classical Athens, let's focus on that. Here, there were four main groups. The upper class were the elite, the cream of the crop, and we all know that the cream rises to the top. To be a part of the upper class was a birthright. You must have been born in Athens to a moderately or highly wealthy family and be well educated. And a guy. The members of this class were the only ones that held any political power and the only ones classified as citizens. That being the case, the upper class controlled all social and economic policies as well as law. As a democracy, 500 citizens were chosen at random each year to run the government, given complete control over the proposal of new policies and laws. Kind of like an oligarchy. These policies were either accepted or rejected by popular vote. Next was the middle class. Usually referred to as the medics, they were all the dudes who weren't born in Athens but still lived there. Foreign skilled laborers such as craftsmen, merchants, and artists. These guys built ships, constructed buildings, and kept the city maintained. Sure, they didn't have a lot of rights like the ability to own land or vote in governmental affairs, but they were the core of the Greek economy. You know, a thing that barely exists today. Oh yeah, women were also part of the middle class. Not many rights outside of being in charge of the house and raising the kids. Ancient Greek society wasn't too fair to women. The lower class, or the freedmen, were exactly who you think they were. Come on, it's right there in the name. They were freed men, former slaves who bought their own freedom through intensive labor and saving. They pulled themselves up by their sandal straps and worked hard their whole life, only to have little to no rights or place in society. But hey, at least they aren't smelly slaves anymore. Slaves were lower than dirt in the societal hierarchy and weren't even considered a class. They were usually captured prisoners of war or purchased from former traders. Slaves were either owned by families as house servants or by the government outright for general labor, which came in all kinds of flavors. Farmers, bankers, soldiers, employed friends with benefits, police, all kinds of stuff. Imagine being arrested by a slave. Sir, you have the right to remain silent. Huh, well, at least I have rights. Slaves made up about a third of the population and were an absolute goldmine for their owners. Profit margins are pretty healthy when you don't have to pay them much. Or at all. Speaking of gold mines, that's where you're headed. Time to get branded and get a move on. You're swiftly carted off to join a group of miners so large it would cause a YouTube elite to start sweating. Oh man, looks like all the cool slaves have been sent to the surface mine to get gold and silver, but since your mining level sucks, you get to go underground for some cuprum. That's copper. Working in a mine was brutal. Slaves were subjected to intense labor all day, working in poorly ventilated and swelteringly hot cave systems hundreds of feet deep in the earth, illuminated only by dim oil lamps. You can't see shit, which means your fellow slaves can't see jack shit, so watch out for rogue pickaxes. You toil away day in and day out for a while now, but notice that, like the rock around you, you're getting chiseled. The combination of your new Mediterranean diet and constant physical exertion is starting to pay off. You're able to mine more efficiently, and you're outperforming your coworkers. Thanks to all of your hard work and dedication, the local mine supervisor rewards you with more backbreaking work. Looks like you gotta add your pride to a list of things getting crushed around these parts. You're working hard and gaining some gains, but you need to start finding a way out of here soon. You see, the life expectancy for miners was only a few years. With hazards like coal dust, lead exposure, and cave-ins, it was a quick way to have your lifespan get completely rocked. Ah, jeez. Looks like Atticus is showing signs of a fever. And Pucus over there? He's earning his namesake. You ask your buddy Atlas what the heck's going on, to which he responds, looks like they all caught some sort of... No matter where you throw a dart on the board of history, diseases were always in the spotlight. Perhaps the most common in classical Greek times were smallpox, influenza, and measles. Luckily for you, your parents love you and got you vaccinated when you were just a wee babby, right? Of course, otherwise you'd look like this. But ancient Greeks weren't so lucky. It was pretty common for outbreaks to be spontaneous and run rampant, killing off people by the thousands. And what kind of disease discussion would it be without the mention of the plague? Yeah, the plague showed up in ancient Athens right around 430 BC, 10 years before you arrived. During that time, it eradicated between 75 to 100,000 people, or about a quarter of the city's population. The plague comes in 3 flavors: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, and strawberry. They're all basically the same thing, but affect you in different ways. Bubonic was the most common, as it's kind of stage 1 of the plague. Usually transferred from a flea giving you a little nibble, the plague is a bacterial infection that just penetrates your cells and fills them with toxins, killing them. This will also cause you to have a fever, the chills, and make you generally feel like shit. Your body will also start getting polluted with bumpy boils. If left untreated, the infection can spread to your blood, where it upgrades to septicemic plague. This is when parts of your body get the rot and start to turn black, causing severe pain as well as more frequent, unprovoked traffic stops. If the infection gets into your lungs, that's when it's classified as pneumonic plague. You begin coughing like crazy, and your respiratory system starts to fail. And that's no good. Luckily, doctors at the time relied less on the big guys in the sky for help and decided to take matters into their own hands, establishing and developing the concept of medical treatment. It was widely believed that the key to a healthy life was to consume healthy foods like fruits, veggies, nuts, meats, and dairy, not to mention plenty of exercise. Crazy thought, right? But if you did get the ick, there were a few solutions. The most common was bloodletting. Look, you're just a big walking blood sac, and since you're sick, that means you've got time to get rid of that. Thanks, Doc. I feel so... Other treatments were often natural remedies like herbs, soups, teas, and honey to heal your little stummy. But anyway, you're safe cause you're vaccinated, which means that you're the sole survivor of a recent outbreak and you really like trains. Guess you're a free man now. Being very free and very man means that you now have access to education. Sorry ladies, you're gonna have to wait a while before you learn good. Time to hit the books. Now that your yearning for the minds is now a yearning for learning, it's time to trade your physical gains for mental ones. Ancient Greece had a wealth of educational resources including public and private schools, personal tutors, intellectual lectures, and a recent invention: books. Books started showing up around the 5th century. It was a great way to record down your stories and lectures without having to memorize them. But some pretentious Greek geeks like the famed philosopher Socrates believed that books would be the downfall of society, as people would just write things down rather than commit knowledge to memory. But imagine this: if you wanted to learn a story or a bit of information, you had to catch Rheticus on a Tuesday afternoon next to a fountain in the park, but you showed up a little bit late and missed half the story.
Yeah, can you rewind like 10 minutes, please?
Found a really good Euro spot. You want some? More for me. You attend several lectures and slowly learn to read and write the local dialect, Attic Greek. Not to be confused with Basement Greek. Although they were rare, you managed to find a small public library to see if there's anything interesting, when something catches your eye. Oh, no way. What the fuck? Like I said, I'd survive.
Well, that was quite the entrance you've made, but you couldn't have picked a worse time to fall out of the sky. Looks like you've landed in Salem, Massachusetts. You know, the place with all of the witches and whatnot? Yeah, that one. Now don't be fooled. It may seem like a simple, peaceful, and wholesome village. Tread carefully, because one wrong move could have you swinging from a rope. So, do you think you could survive this Puritan hellhole? Let's find out. Welcome to Salem, Massachusetts. Founded in 1626, the settlement of Salem quickly established itself as a bastion for English Puritans. They were a group of religious nutjobs who sailed over from across the pond after facing religious persecution. Basically, their religion was a tad too crazy, even for the Church of England. You see, Puritans wholly believed that they were God's chosen few, that only they would be allowed through the cloud-covered pearly gates and everyone else could kick rocks. In hell. They also believed that Big Red Spirit Halloween Satan himself roamed the earth, wreaking havoc as a full-time job. Anything odd or inexplicable was the devil's doing, and any acts of the devil were met with swift punishment. Excuse me, what are you doing? Oh, just having a whistle. Oh. Not in this village, you're not. Pardon me, what are you doing? Oh, for fuck. Being a Puritan society, religious figures were the ones that ruled, and the biblical texts were the rules. Whatever the book says goes, with no room for improvisation.
Subscribe.
The church itself controlled everything, from the way you walked to the way you talked, from how you were dressed to what you'd ingest. But the church often stressed how you should feel blessed, so if you've ever felt repressed, you must confess or be placed under arrest. Gotta love a concentrated society of religious fanatics. What could go wrong? Right? Fast forward several decades, and here we are in a cold January in 1692, the start of a new year for the town. Well, you've got to get to fitting in, so best introduce yourself.
Good morrow.
Hello.
Pardon?
Bad move. The word hello won't be used as a greeting for another 100 years.
Thou art not from around hither, art thou?
No?
Methought so.
Try again.
Good morrow.
Good morrow. That's better. Remember, the great thing about a small village like this is that everyone knows each other. The worst thing is that everyone knows each other. But it looks like you're about to run into someone familiar? Dude! Ron? Is that you?
Yes, sir.
Where the hell did you come from?
Well, I saw this cool little green portal thingy and jumped right on through. Heck of a ride. Wouldn't do it again, though. It inverted my belly button and made me piss myself. Anyway, look who I found.
Who's that?
This loose slab of butter right here is my great something or other Uncle Jimothy, Salem's finest blacksmith, so I've been told. Aye.
How'd you figure that out?
Well, I asked him. Anyways, where were we?
I think we were just talking about... The hell was that?
Let's check it out.
Oh boy, the two girls pitching a fit on the ground are none other than 12-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Betty Paris. Their actions are about to set forth quite a series of unfortunate events, and they won't even star Jim Carrey. Looks like this calls for a doctor's opinion. Aye, this be a case of witchcraft.
No way.
If there's one place you don't want to be in this world, it's being in the middle of a religion-obsessed community that's been given the news that the devil himself may be walking amongst them. The news of the girl's possible bewitchment set the entire village of Salem completely on edge. Despite a solid month of good old homemade remedies like fasting, burning herbs, Jorkin crystals, or that iconic prayer mumbo-jumbo, nothing seemed to work. Were the girls just joshing? Or was something more malevolent lurking in the shadows? Samuel Paris, the town's minister and father to Itty Bitty Betty, was desperate for answers. Finally, someone offered a more creative approach. Entering stage left is Samuel's neighbor, Mary Sibley. Entering stage right are Sam Paris's personal servants, John Indian and Tituba.
They're slaves.
Together, the three concocted a plan to fight fire with fire. Since desperate times call for desperate measures, this brought the concept of counter magic to the table. Although a potential solution, however a bunch of baloney it may be, the act of performing counter magic was just as offensive in the eyes of Puritans as black magic, and just as dangerous.
Shoo-ba-da-boo!
But what are you gonna do? Just let your daughter or niece scream and flail about on the ground like they were told no at a toy store? Didn't think so. So, Reverend Paris did what he had to do. The proposed solution? Just bake a cake. Now, it's easy to bake a pretty cake, but you gotta do the cooking by the book. And this is the book. So, this is the cake. Made from a mix of rye flour and, I shit you not, a cup of the afflicted's own urine, this disgusting dessert was then offered to the Paris' dog as a way to ward off these sinister symptoms and, in turn, cause physical harm to the witch responsible for casting the curse. Shockingly, it didn't work. And to make matters worse, 2 more young girls were getting down with the sickness. The girls claimed that they were being constantly tormented by evil spirits, but none of the other villagers ever witnessed the supposed spooky specters.
My sweet spazzing children, who did this to you?
Oh, hell no!
The girls named 3 women as witches: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. The 3 were arrested and brought before a court to confess their crimes. Both Sarahs maintained their innocence, but Tituba caved. She confessed that she, along with Sarah 1 and Sarah 2, were wicked witches. Now, why in the frickin' heck would she do this, you might ask, scratching your itchy kneecaps? Because Sam Paris, her master, told her to. After being formally accused, Tituba was threatened to admit guilt or be smashed KO'd off screen with 0 stock. So which do you choose? Death at the hands of a single man, or by a jury of your peers? She chose the latter. But to throw a wrench into things, Tituba offered one more tidbit of information. There were more witches in the village. She just didn't know who. It could be anybody. Little Ann could have an evil plan. Big James could be casting flames. Could it be Johnny with his golden fiddle? Or Tom, whose last name is Riddle? No one knew, and that was the problem. In one fell swoop, Tituba used history's greatest weapon: fear. And this wasn't just the run up my basement steps really fast so the demons don't get me type of fear. This was full-blown paranoia. And paranoia is an unlubed shaft just aching to cause some damage. Fear was at an all-time high, and trust was at an all-time low. With neighbors now turning on each other at the slightest inconvenience, this led to an overwhelming increase in accusations. So let's take a look at what it took to be accused of witchcraft. When paranoia goes full tilt, no one is safe. No man, woman, child, or even the village dog is free from suspicion. Between February of 1692 and May of 1693, it's believed that over 200 people in and around Salem were accused of witchcraft. The main character in a lot of these allegations was 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., who was personally responsible for putting over 60 innocent people on trial, some of whom were executed. But you didn't have to be caught red-handed smearing toad blood in a pentagram of candles to be considered an evil witch. Even simple, everyday tasks or coincidences were viewed as the devil's work to a bunch of cuckoo crazy people. If you found yourself strong enough to lift a heavy gun, it's because the devil helped you, so now your days are done. If you can kill off crops with just a single glance, there's not much I can say. You don't stand a chance. If you brewed a bit of food that a rude dude chewed and subsequently spewed, your years of life accrued were about to conclude. Even petting a black cat without giving a dang, each one of these reasons was enough for you to hang. Now, if you think that these were just dope rhymes with no reason, you're wrong. These were very real claims by the people of Salem. George Burroughs, one of Salem's ex-ministers, was a beefy boy. He lifted a really heavy musket when no one else could. Very impressive, but a bit too impressive. He was tried and executed. Martha Carrier faced the gallows after apparently hexing and killing a neighbor's entire livestock by just looking at them. It was pure mayhem. But not everyone agreed with what was going on. Luckily, some sound-minded villagers were not buying the bullshit, and many protested the imprisonment of obviously innocent people. Unluckily, those who called the trials a bunch of baloney were also thrown in the clink.
This is a bunch of baloney. This ain't witchcraft.
Ron? Oh no, looks like Ron's about to face a fate worse than death. The legal system. Well, time for a trial. Here we are, the trials of the century. Well, I guess multiple centuries since we're still talking about them. News of witchcraft allegations reached far and wide, prompting intervention from the Massachusetts government to sort it all out. Thus, the Salem witch trials commenced, fancy powdered wigs and all. You know, English things. Thankfully, since the trials happened only a few hundred years ago, there's still lots of surviving documents from Salem. Lots of them. So we can still get a pretty clear picture of how everything went down, or at least the version that was written. The court structure was very similar to what it is today. A judge, a jury, witnesses, testimonies, all that. But sprinkling in the complete paranoia that infested the village, things got interesting. The main accusers, the teenage girls Abigail Williams and Ann Putnam Jr., were present at pretty much every trial, much to the dismay of anyone whom they accused. If the defendants gave any attempt at denying the allegations, then the show would start. For poor Bridget Bishop, the girls claimed that they were being tortured by her evil spooky ghost. The girls would break out into fits and convincing seizures in court to make it seem like Bishop was cursing them from afar, like a witch would.
That's not how that works.
Bridget Bishop was convicted and hanged on June 10, 1692. Miss Martha Corey's testimony saw some real creativity. After publicly calling out the girls on their bullshit, Martha put herself in the crosshairs and was forced to defend her own innocence in court shortly after. While giving her testimony, the girls began to mimic her movements. When Martha raised her hand, so did the girls. If she turned her head, they followed. The girls cried out, claiming that they were being puppeted by the devil, and Martha was the one pulling the strings.
Art thou fucking serious?
72-year-old Martha Corey was convicted and hanged on September 22nd, 1692. Martha's husband, Giles, is probably the most famous death of these Salem witch trials. But the guy was a certified asshole, having turned on his own wife after she was accused, ultimately testifying against her and giving examples of her witchcraft, like reading too much or nagging him too often. He did later attempt to rescind these allegations, but it was a bit too late as she was already doomed to hang. Now, with Giles being on trial himself, he refused to plead guilty or not guilty. He knew that regardless of his plea, he would still end up being converted to a human wind chime. Boy, was he wrong. Instead, he was given more pressing matters. Literally. As punishment for his supposed crimes, Giles was forced to endure peine forte Dieu. That's French for strong and hard pain. What this meant was being laid on the ground under a board. Big, beautiful boulders were added to the board, distributing their weight across his body. Hundreds of pounds of stone pressed down on Corey across 3 whole days. His final words? More weight. He was 81, but now it looks like it's Ron's turn to defend himself. Let's see how that goes.
Ronald J. Fartknocker, thou hast been accused of witchcraft. What say you in your defense?
I didn't do shit.
He's innocent!
Huh? What's all this?
Your Honor, I've known Ron for years. We've been through so much together.
That's right. We sort of survived a whole nuclear apocalypse together. He knows what a real witch is. She's been using powerful magic to torment him for years, sending him all across time. Greece, Japan, Egypt, you name it.
It's true. Wait a minute. I only ever told you about the nuclear apocalypse. How did you know about the others?
You just couldn't go along with it, could you? And here I thought you were a smart fella, not a fart smeller.
You're not Ron. You're...
No. Took you long enough.
That's a witch. Well, we've never really burned a witch before, but we'll take your word for it. Yeah, it'll work. History facts that are wrong. This is probably one of the first things we all learned about in school when discussing ancient Egypt. Tens of thousands of slaves enduring endless hours of intense, forced physical labor while barely being fed or provided with adequate water. Drop a sack of sand, chisel something at the wrong angle, devout masochist, you're getting a whipping. Well, it's all poppycock. While there were slaves, they were mainly prisoners of war or household servants who tended to their landlords, but they weren't really part of the main labor force. Instead, laborers in ancient Egypt were conscripted using the corvée duty system, a way to pay off taxes through manual labor. According to the book The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt, which discusses the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt, farmers were usually pulled from their laborious crop dusting for construction work whenever the Nile went all floody during the summer months. While the snobby rich upper class folk avoided manual labor by just paying off their tax burden, them smelly poors were tasked with construction of temples, tombs, and pyramids. Laborers who worked on the pyramids, as well as other large structures way back in the ancient times, were actually well provided for. This makes sense, as having a weakened labor force due to neglect or malnourishment, it doesn't really pay great dividends. Can't exactly move giant rocks when you're completely emaciated. Small villages have been discovered built specifically for housing laborers. These sites also contain various animal bones and plentiful bread jars showing a high-quality diet. But of course, the system wasn't perfect. Thanks to some classic upper-class corruption, sometimes things didn't always go right for these laborers, but they had the power to stand their ground. Dating all the way back to 1170 BC, written evidence has been found of an artisan's strike while constructing a tomb for then-pharaoh Ramesses III. The artisans complained about a lack of promised rations and outright refused to continue their work, dropping their chisels and their hammers to march right up to the ruling class's temples to make their demands. What do we want? Food! When do we want it? Food! After chit-chatting with the local vizier, the workers were able to secure the rations and continued their work. Now don't get me wrong, the labor that these guys endured was backbreaking, extremely strenuous, and downright exhausting, but they weren't outright enslaved or mistreated, as historians previously thought. We've all heard the legends about King Tut's tomb, right? If you disturb an ancient king's burial grounds, you'll be cursed, doomed to die a horrible death. Well, it's not so. You'd probably cough a bit from inhaling millennia-old mummy powder, but that's about it. Now, there has been evidence of some ancient tombs inscribed with curse-like carvings. For example, ancient warlord and Egyptian noble Ankh-Tifi wrote that, quote, "Any ruler who shall do evil or wickedness to his coffin, may the gods not accept any goods he offers, and may his heir never inherit." Similarly, an inscription on the tomb of 10th century BC ruler Kentika Ikeki warns that any impure men who enter this tomb, there will be judgment. An end shall be made for him. I shall seize his neck like a bird, and I shall cast the fear of myself into him. Now, in a culture that was super superstitious, anyone coming across warnings like that would be like,
"Oh shit! A ghost!"
prompting them to 180 right out of the room. When King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922, no such written reprimands or warnings were ever found. In reality, the rumor of King Tut's curse revolves around one George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a rich English white dude who funded the whole expedition that led to the discovery of the Sandy sarcophagus. He died a whole 4 months after the opening of the tomb. After which a journalist did what journalists do and printed a whole bunch of sensationalized fake news, attributing Lord Carnarvon's death to an inexplicable curse. To no surprise, the media ran with it, making claims of a written curse being uncovered with the tomb, though this never happened. So how did Lord Carnarvon die? He done got bit by a mosquito. The resulting bump was accidentally slashed while he was shaving, making a pretty nasty cut that later got infected. The old chap died of blood poisoning at the age of 56. Dedicated believers have tried to attribute other deaths to the curse, but they're really grasping for straws. Of the 58 people who were present at the opening of the tomb, only 8 had died within a dozen years of the discovery, and by various means ranging from cancer to murder to natural causes. The majority of the men went to live on full, healthy lives. At least they didn't steal any spooky slabs. That might have been a different story. When you think of Spartans, you probably think about them slippery, shiny hunks of warrior man meat as portrayed on the silver screen. A society of strict and viciously trained bloodthirsty warriors who could decimate any opposing army. But while you're thinking about oiled up, shirtless, muscular men, you might question if this portrayal is historically accurate. It's not. In reality, the Greek city-state of Sparta had no professional army. Although growing up with militaristic training, the purpose was not to create warriors, but perfected, hardened, and respectable citizens who could serve to defend their homeland if need be. That little element of perfection is where some rumors of Spartan eugenics come in. It is believed that ancient Spartans practiced infanticide, the act of killing deformed or undesired babies as a way to strengthen the Spartan society. However, the biggest downfall of this myth is that there's only one historical source that alludes to this barbaric practice, and it's this guy, Roman historian Plutarch. He wrote that Spartan elders would examine newborns for imperfections or weaknesses. Good, bad, good. What the?
Hello, Daddy.
Ew. If any were ever found, they would just yeetus the fetus off the Taygetus mountainside. This ensured that only the best of the best would be able to thrive to crushing adulthood. But this bit of literature is almost certainly a bunch of baloney. While historians can't confirm with 100% certainty, they can confirm with 99.9% certainty that this just flat out never happened. Excavations around the proposed baby hucking sites have failed to present any supporting evidence. There have been a few adult remains discovered, but no teeny tiny toddler tibias were ever among them. If you needed more convincing, Plutarch's writings date some 600 years after the height of Spartan civilization. So it might have just been some silly Spartan slander. That would be like if future archaeologists in the year 4000 unearthed fanfiction from today about how medieval Europeans would just shit their britches to ward off witches. Sure, it's questionable, but you could kind of see that happening, right? Despite what you may think, death was not the goal of gladiator battles in the Roman Colosseum. If it was, Rome would have run out of them real quick. Now keep in mind that the Colosseum was active for over 400 years, hosting a plethora of different events ranging from gladiator battles to public criminal executions to full-fledged naval battle reenactments with the entire Colosseum being flooded. Pretty wild, right? Well, gladiator battles were basically the equivalent of today's UFC or boxing matches, just with swords and spears instead of fists. These fights were spectacles of sport, and the gladiators were the athletes. You had some super famous gladiators, rookie gladiators, and everything in between. While some gladiators were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war fighting for their chance of freedom, most of the big old brutes fought for fame and fortune, or just the high-octane dopamine rush of being able to legally stab someone in the kidney and getting praised for it. Roman citizens were hyped to watch two dudes duke it out in a sweaty, sandy, sassy struggle of strength. But things were a lot more exciting than just the vanilla missionary position 9-to-5 white picket fence 1.5 children-ass sword and shield type gladiators. Nope. Actually, there were about 30 different types of gladiators ready to clang and bang away at each other. You had your dual-wielding Demochirus, the trident-chucking Retiarius, the silly-looking Caesar, and the alls-out, balls-out Cestus, among other DLC characters. So imagine that you're living your boring Roman life, sitting in your boring Roman house, scratching your boring Roman balls when you suddenly catch wind of the gladiator battle of the century. Two andabate pitted against each other. You'd lose your shit. Why would you lose your shit? Because andabate were condemned criminals fighting each other completely blind. Yeah, as a form of punishment, two criminals equipped with nothing more than a sealed helmet and a rusty sword were dumped out into the arena and forced to square off. It's like watching two blindfolded kids trying to whack at a piñata, except they're both potential piñatas. Now, while formal gladiator duels were not to the death, of course some still died, but it was more common to die by bleeding out after the match had been called by the referee. Oh yeah, they had referees. These were often retired gladiators tasked with making sure that the rules of battle were being followed and stopping fights before final blows were dealt. You see, gladiators were expensive investments, so their managers wanted them alive for as long as possible, lest they start all over leveling up another rookie from scratch. So with all that being said, professional gladiator battles were not performed for the sake of death, just for the thrill of the fight, and the potential of death. Ancient myths are tough for modern historians to interpret, as historical writers across time have their own biases. Depending on how they felt about a certain historical figure, they could cement their legacy in history as a smart fella or a fart smella. The prevailing myth that Roman Emperor Nero diddled his fiddle as Rome burned to the ground is one that should go up in smoke. It's commonly believed that Nero, having descended into madness over the course of his reign, started the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, a disastrous and destructive inferno that destroyed nearly 3/4 of the Roman capital. Accusations claim that Nero didn't really like the look of Rome and wanted to rebuild it in his own vision with a lavish and gaudy golden palace, so a conveniently timed fire would have been a great opportunity to do so. The fire is suspected to have started in a shopping district stockpiled with flammable goods. Once the fire started, it was nearly impossible to contain. Rome was a dense city, streets were narrow, housing structures were wooden, and the wind was a-blowin'. This set of conditions provided the perfect environment for the big ol' fire to really roar. The blaze lasted for 9 whole days, decimating 10 of Rome's 14 districts. But was Emperor Nero to blame? Not at all. According to Tacitus, one of the most influential Roman historians at the time, Nero was not near Rome when the fire started. He was actually several miles away in the coastal town of Antium, but he rushed back home to Rome once he caught wind of the disaster. When he did get back, Nero actually funded relief efforts and opened up private gardens and other structures for shelter to those affected. Despite these efforts, Nero still came under scrutiny from the nobles who hated him, claiming that he should have responded sooner and provided more assistance.
Freaking Nero, dude. I bet my scorched ass cheeks he started that fire himself.
Yeah, you're right, he probably did. Guys, he was literally miles away in another city.
What did you do?
And that's how rumors start. In actual fact, there is no historical evidence that Nero started the fire, and especially no evidence that he played the fiddle when Rome burned, mostly because the fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 900 years. It's probable that the claim is part of Christian propaganda, as Nero famously blamed them for the fire, leading to their persecution. So who really got the last laugh? It was Nero. He burned a lot of Christians. It's possible that your middle school history textbooks may have toyed with the idea that ancient Aztecs, or even the greater Mexican people as a whole, saw the invading Spanish conquistadors as godlike figures. More specifically, history has suggested that the Aztec ruler Moctezuma, or Montezuma, however you want to pronounce it, believed that the arrival of the Spanish coincided with the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent god of creation. But we now know that it's all, as the Spanish say, a bunch of caca. It's certainly true that the native Mexican people were stunned and confused by the appearance of the foreign invaders with their fancy horses, gunpowder, and white skin, but there's no evidence explicitly stating that they were thought of as gods. Letters written by Hernan Cortés himself about his conquests never mention being mistaken for or being interpreted as a god in any way, shape, or form. And this is further supported by the writings of Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who chronicled Cortez's conquests in real time. One passage highlights a conversation between Cortez and Moctezuma in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Conversation basically had Moctezuma being like, yeah, people around here think I'm a god, that I'm all about gold and silver and precious stones, but look, you see that? Flesh and blood, my dude. We're both the same. I know that you're just a bunch of foreigners and not some otherworldly divine beings. That would just be silly. To which Cortez replied, so where did this idea come from? Well, it actually started to surface decades after the Aztecs were conquered. Publications of Spanish conquests alluded to the idea that Cortez and his men tried to pass their weapons off as magic and their horses off as intelligent, aggressive beasts. So it was mainly a sensationalized retelling of events, portraying the Mexica people as more feeble-minded, all while embellishing the Spanish image.
As it turns out, the Aztec weren't bamboozled by some distrustful deity. The Spanish completely steamrolled the Aztec with the help of guns, alliances to Aztec rivals, and every European explorer's iconic weapon, disease.
It was less, oh my god, and more,
Oh my god!
The Great Depression was truly a financial disaster, not only for the US, but for the entire globe. Most of you out there might recall learning that the stock market crash of 1929 caused the Great Depression, but in reality, it was just the signal that shit had hit the financial fan. Nothing more than a devastating effect from a much more threatening underlying cause. If you're unaware, the world economy is a constant struggle for balance of supply and demand, with price being the end result. Lots of demand and no supply, prices go up. Lots of supply but no buyers, prices go down. Sure, that's a bit oversimplified, but you get the idea. The Great Depression was a catastrophic chain of events stemming from US overproduction of goods. You see, in the early 1920s, the world had entered a time of peace at the end of World War I. This led to an industrial boom, not for war machines, but for consumer goods. Mass production was going wild, and factories were farting out new products like crazy. To sell these products, companies began aggressive advertising campaigns. The news, radio, magazines, and everything just screamed in your face to buy the latest and greatest doohickey. And the people did. But how could customers afford all of this lavish spending?
Yup, the establishment of consumer credit.
Cars, appliances, clothes, homes, all purchased on credit. But the United States was not the only beneficiary of a peacetime economy. European and Asian markets began producing their own goods, selling these products to the US for cheaper prices, which caught the eyes of consumers looking to save a few pennies here and there. The big American companies, seeing potential profits leaving their grubby hands, were pissed and lobbied Congress to protect their interests. In order to do so, the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 was passed. This raised American tariffs across the board, increasing the consumer cost of foreign goods as to thin out the competition and force Americans to buy American products. Europe and Asia promptly responded in kind, and soon a tariff war commenced. All this sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Now, in order to keep a super long story super short, here's what happened next. Demand shrank as American companies and farms overproduced their goods. Too much stuff and no one to buy it means less sales. Less sales means less profit for these companies, and with less company profit, that means they're gonna start handing out some pink slips. With lots of people laid off, lots of people have less money to spend, so companies lose even more money, and if they lose enough of it, they go bankrupt. Now, when companies went bankrupt, at least back in the 1920s, the banks that supported them failed. And when the banks failed, people's money straight up vanished, thanks to the lack of FDIC insurance. Everyone loses their shit and rushes to withdraw money from whatever banks are still standing, but there's not enough physical cash to meet that demand. Now, all of a sudden, no one has money. So what happened to it all? The banks lent it out to all the rich people, placing speculative bets on the stock market. Now, when there's a lot of market speculation, stock market prices get unreasonably high. Unreasonably high prices aren't very sexy, so no one else wants to buy them. Instead, they sell to take profits. But when these profits are taken, that stock price drops. When stock prices drop, any remaining shareholders lose potential profit, which is no bueno. So they panic sell whatever shares they have. And when there's enough seller momentum across the board, the entire stock market crashes. So banks have failed, blue-collar workers have lost their life savings overnight, millionaires have lost their fortunes, factories have folded, and farmers have hung up their tools. Not only did this cripple the United States, but the entirety of global trade. The United States could not meet critical export demands, and foreign economies selling raw materials such as sugar, rubber, and lumber lost their biggest customer, and thus most of their money, impacting their economies. The Great Depression was without doubt one of the worst economic disasters of the modern age. The American economy struggled until the United States entered World War II in 1941, where demand for production and labor picked right back up. To put it simply, the 1929 stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It was the writing on the wall that the system was breaking. Afterward, the banking system was overhauled and the stock market heavily regulated to prevent history from repeating itself. And we'll see how that goes.